My son called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me I was no longer welcome in his home. He didn't lead with it. He never leads with hard things, my Marcus. He circles around them the way you circle a fire you're not sure is safe. But eventually the words came out, and when they did, they were not even his words. I could hear her in every syllable. I had just finished making a pot of coffee. I remember that detail with strange clarity, the way I was standing at the counter with the mug in my hand, watching the steam rise, and how I set it down very carefully when I understood what he was saying, as though the mug might break if I wasn't careful, as though I might. He was 51 years old, my son, and he was calling to tell me that his wife had decided I couldn't come to the house anymore. I want you to understand what that house meant before I tell you what happened with it, because this story isn't really about a will or about money or about legal documents. It's about a mother and her son, and the slow, quiet way a person can be pushed out of a life they helped build. My name is Eleanor. I am 73 years old. I raised Marcus alone from the time he was 9, after his father left in the way that certain men leave. Not with a fight, not with a dramatic scene, but with a gradual disappearance, a fading out, until one day you realize the space where a person used to be has been empty for so long you've almost stopped noticing. Richard wasn't a villain, he was just a man who found the weight of a family heavier than he wanted to carry, and he set it down. So I carried it. I worked as a nurse for 31 years, the night shift more often than not, because nights paid a differential, and the differential mattered when you were the only income, and your son needed new shoes and school supplies, and the kind of ordinary things that feel enormous when the budget is tight. I came home in the mornings with tired eyes and made Marcus breakfast before school, and tried very hard to let him see how tired I was, because children carry what they see, and I didn't want him carrying my exhaustion. He was a good boy. That sounds simple, but I mean it in the complicated way. Good not because he was easy, he wasn't always easy, but because underneath everything there was this fundamental decency in him, this orientation toward kindness that I believed in completely. I watched him grow into a man who held doors open for strangers and remembered birthdays and called his grandmother every Sunday until she died. That was the Marcus I knew. He met Diane when he was 43. I want to be fair about Diane. I want to tell this story without making her into a caricature, because she's a real person, and real people are complicated, and I have spent a lot of time trying to understand her and not simply resent her. She is, a woman with strong opinions and a deep need for control over her environment, which I recognized from the beginning, and which I told myself, back then, was not necessarily a problem. Strong-willed women and I have always gotten along reasonably well. The first time I met her, she was perfectly pleasant. We had dinner at a restaurant Marcus chose, and she asked me questions about my nursing career and listened to the answers with what seemed like genuine interest. And she told me about her own work. She managed a property development company, small but profitable. And I thought, well, this is a capable woman. Marcus has found someone capable. I thought that was enough. I was wrong. The signs were small at first, the way they always are. A certain firmness about how the holidays would be structured that felt less like a preference and more like an announcement, a way of redirecting conversations about Marcus's childhood, his history, before her, that I initially read as insecurity and tried to gently accommodate, a distance that felt managed rather than natural, like something deliberate being maintained. They got married 2 years after they met. Small wedding, Diane's preference, though she let me believe it was a mutual decision, and it was only later I learned from Marcus that he'd wanted something larger, had wanted his cousins and old friends there, and had allowed Diane to narrow the guest list in the name of what she called intimacy, and what I came to think of as control. I was there. I sat in the front row and watched my son marry this woman, and I felt what every mother feels, the particular bittersweet ache of watching someone you love make a choice that will take them somewhere you can't fully follow. I cried during the ceremony. Diane noticed and gave me a look I filed away in the back of my mind, a look I couldn't quite name then, but that I can name now. It was a look of assessment. She was figuring out what my tears meant and what to do with them. For the first year, I visited every few weeks. Marcus and I had a rhythm: Sunday calls, visits every third or fourth week, dinner at their house or occasionally mine. Diane was present for these visits in the way of someone who is technically there, but has positioned herself at a slight remove, orbiting the edges of the conversation without fully entering it. She was never rude, she was never warm. The invitations started to thin in the second year. The every 3 weeks became every 5, then every 7. When I called Marcus to suggest a visit, there was often a pause before he answered. Just a small one, almost imperceptible, but I'm a mother and I've been reading that voice my entire adult life, and I felt the pause even when I pretended not to. "We've just been busy," he'd say. "Of course," I'd say. And I would mean it, or try to. People are busy. Married couples build their own worlds. I'd read enough books and heard enough stories about mothers-in-law to know that I didn't want to be that woman, the one who couldn't let go, who showed up too often and called too much, and made her son's wife feel crowded in her own home. I was careful. I was so careful. But careful has its own costs, and one of them is that sometimes you're so busy being careful not to take up too much space that you don't notice someone else is moving the walls in around you. The third year, Diane redecorated the house. This sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. Marcus had lived in that house for 6 years before they got married. It was his house first, bought with money he'd earned and saved, and the rooms of it were full of things that told the story of his life, his past, his history, before her. A bookshelf with the paperbacks he'd been collecting since his 20s, a framed photograph of the two of us at his college graduation, me with younger eyes and a smile that took up my whole face. A few pieces of furniture that had been mine and that I'd given him when he moved in, a side table, a lamp, a wooden chest that had belonged to my mother. I found about the chest on a Sunday visit. I was using the bathroom and passed through the kitchen, and I just happened to look toward the garage door, which was standing open, and I saw it through the gap, sitting on the concrete floor between a rake and some storage boxes. My mother's chest. I didn't say anything. I went back to the table and finished my coffee and talked about something unrelated and drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for 15 minutes, holding the steering wheel, not crying, just feeling the weight of it. That was 3 years before the phone call. In those 3 years, the visits became monthly, then bi-monthly. The texture of them changed. They felt supervised somehow, like there was an agenda being managed that I wasn't aware of. Diane would sometimes be there and sometimes not, and her absence was almost a relief, except for the way I could feel her presence in the way Marcus sat, the topics he steered around, the things he did and didn't say. My granddaughter was born in February in the 3rd year of their marriage, Lily. I want to tell you about Lily because she is the true center of this story, more than the will, more than the house, more than any of the dynamics between adults that I've been describing. Lily is what this was always about underneath. She was born in February, on a Sunday, the same day of week Marcus was born, and when Marcus called me from the hospital, I cried in a way I hadn't since his father left, not from pain this time, but from something I don't have a word for. The specific, overwhelming feeling of discovering that love can expand again, that there's always more room.
I was allowed to visit the hospital. I was allowed to hold her, this new small creature with Marcus's nose. I was allowed
Diane's
to visit
forehead
the hospital
and her own
I was allowed to
particular
hold
way
her,
of looking
this
at you.
new small
Very
creature
serious,
with Marcus's
like she was
nose
taking notes.
and Diane's
I
forehead
held her
and
and
her
thought,
own
"Here
particular
we go
way of
again,
looking at
the
you.
long work
Very
of loving
serious,
someone."
like she was taking notes.
I was not
I held
allowed
her
to be
and
the
thought,
primary babysitter.
"Here we go again."
This was
the
established,
long work of
not
loving
explicitly,
someone,
but through a series of
I
small
was not allowed
fence-building
to be the
conversations
primary babysitter
within the first few
This
months.
was established.
Diane's
not
mother,
explicitly,
who lived
but through 40 minutes
series of
closer than
small
I did
fence-building
would be the main
conversations
child care
within the
support.
first few months.
I understood that
Diane's
this was
mother,
reasonable
who
on
lived
its
40
face.
minutes closer than I
Proximity
did,
matters
would
when
be
you
the
have a
main
baby
child
and you
care
need help.
support.
I told
understood
myself
that
it was
this was
reasonable on its
but there's
face.
reasonable,
Proximity
and then
matters
there's
when
the
you have a
feeling,
baby
which
and
I
you need
couldn't
help.
shake,
I
of
told
being
myself it was
systematically
reasonable.
positioned on the
But there's
outside of
reasonable,
something.
and then there's
Lily
the
was
feeling,
2
which
when I
I
started
couldn't
to
shake,
notice
of
what I
being
can only
systematically
describe as a
positioned
pattern
on the
of
outside of
replacement.
something.
Photographs
Lily
of me
was
with
2
Lily,
when I
and
started
I had
to been
noticed
there. I had
what I
been
can only
present.
describe
I
as
had
a
read to
pattern
her
of
and rocked her
replacement.
and been the
Photographs
person
of
she
me with
reached
Lily,
for with
and
both
I had been
arms
there,
when I
I
walked
had been
into a room.
present,
I
were
had read
never
to
the
her
ones
and
that ended up
rocked her
on the
and
wall
been
or
the
on
person
social
she
media
reached for
or
with
in the
both
little
arms when
printed
I
photo
walked into
books
a
Diane
room.
made.
Were never
The photos
ones
that were
ended up on the
everywhere
wall
were the ones
or on
with
social
Diane's
media
family,
or in
her
the little
parents,
printed
her
photo
sister,
books Diane
her
made.
sister's
The
children,
photos
who
that
were
were
Lily's
everywhere
cousins
were the
on that
ones with
side.
Diane's family.
On my side,
Her
there were
parents,
no cousins.
her sister.
There was
her
only
sister's
me,
children,
and
who
I
were
was the
Lily's
grandmother
cousins
who showed
on
up
that
every
side.
few weeks.
On my
and sat
side,
in the
there
living
were
room
no
that no
cousins.
longer
There
had
was
a
only
single
me,
trace of
and I was
Marcus's
the
life
grandmother
before
who showed
Diane,
up every few
and I
weeks
brought small
and
gifts
sat in the
and
living
cleaned up
room
after
that no
myself,
longer had
and
a
I said
single
goodbye
trace of
before
Marcus's
Lily's
life
bedtime
before
so as
Diane,
not to
and
disrupt
I
the
brought small
routine.
gifts and
I
cleaned
could
up
not
after myself,
locate the
and I said
disruption.
goodbye before
Has
Lily's
something
bedtime
specific
so as
happened?
not to
Something
disrupt
I
the
did
routine.
that upset her?
I could not
The
locate the
pause.
disruption.
It's not
Has
one
something
thing,
specific
he said.
happened?
She
Something
just
I did
she
that
needs to
upset
feel
her?
like her home
The
is her
pause.
space.
It's
Marcus,
not one
I
thing,
said.
he
It's
said.
also your
She
home.
just she needs
Another
to feel like
pause,
her home is
longer.
her space.
Mom,
He said,
Marcus,
and
I said.
in that word
It's also
I heard
your
everything.
home.
The
Another
apology
pause,
he wasn't going
longer.
to make,
Mom,
the explanation
he said,
he didn't
and
have,
in that word
the
I
man
heard
who had been
everything.
positioned
The
between
apology
his mother
he
and
wasn't
his wife
going to make,
and had made
the
his
explanation
choice,
he
perhaps
didn't
without
have,
fully
the man who had
understanding
been
it was a
positioned
choice
between
at all.
his mother and his
I
wife,
said, and had
how
made
long?
his choice,
How long
perhaps
what?
without fully
How long
understanding
am
it
I
was a
not
choice
welcome?
at all. He didn't
I
answer
said,
that. He
how
said
long?
something about it being
How long
temporary,
what?
about needing
How long
time,
am I not
about
welcome?
Diane being under
He
stress.
didn't answer that.
He said he would
something
still call.
about it being temporary.
He said he was sorry,
about needing
he
time.
said he loved me,
about Diane
and I believe
being
he
under
meant
stress,
it,
which
he
made
said
the whole
he would
thing
still
both
call.
better and
He
worse.
said he was sorry.
I said,
he said he loved
okay.
me, and I
Not
believe
because
he meant
I
it,
agreed,
which made
not
the
because
whole
I
thing
thought
both
it was
better
okay,
and worse,
but because I am
I said,
73 years
okay.
old, and I have learned
Not
that
because
some
I agreed,
sentences
not
need
because
to be
I
sat
thought it was
with
okay,
before they can be
but
responded
because
to
I am
properly.
73 years
and
old,
this was
and I
one
have
of them.
learned that some
I
sentences
hung up and stood
need
in
to
my
be
kitchen
sat
with
with
my
before they
cold
can
coffee,
be responded to
and I
properly.
thought about my son
and this
as a
was one of
9-year-old
them.
boy, the morning his father left, standing in the doorway of his room with a look on his face like someone had removed a floor that was supposed to be there. I had gone to him and held him and promised him, without exactly saying the words, that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was the constant. I thought about that promise and what it meant that his wife had now made it a lie. For the first few weeks after the phone call, I existed in a kind of gray quiet. I went about my days. I had been retired for 5 years, so my days had a shape I'd constructed myself. The early walks, the garden, the volunteer work at the hospital 3 mornings a week. I went about all of it. I ate dinner alone in my kitchen and watched the things I liked watching and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I was fine in all the practical ways. But my friend Carol, who has known me for 30 years and can read my face like a map, took one look at me at our Thursday lunch and said, "What happened?" I told her. She sat with it, which is what Carol does. She doesn't rush to fill silence with reaction. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Are you going to fight it?" I thought about that, about what fighting it would look like. The phone calls, the demands, the positioning of myself as the wronged party, the pressure on Marcus to choose. And I knew, with the knowledge that comes from a lifetime of paying attention to people, that none of that would work. Not with Diane, not with the way things were structured between them. Pressure would only harden what was already there. "No," I said, "not like that." "Then, like what?" I didn't have an answer yet. But something was forming, slowly, in the back of my mind. Something quiet. My lawyer's name was Robert, and I had known him for 15 years, since he handled the purchase of my house after I sold the family home where Marcus grew up. He was a patient man with an orderly mind, the kind of lawyer who explained things in plain language and never made you feel stupid for not knowing what he knew. I made an appointment on a Thursday in March, about 6 weeks after the phone call from Marcus. "I want to talk about my will," I said. Robert nodded and folded his hands on the desk in the way he had. I told him the current setup, everything to Marcus, straightforwardly. The house, the savings, not enormous but substantial, 31 years of nursing with careful habits, and a late-in-life inheritance from my own mother that had arrived at exactly the right time to invest well. The total was more than most people would expect from a retired nurse. I had never talked about it openly, not because I was secretive, but because money to me was a private matter, something you managed and didn't perform. Marcus did not know the specific number. Diane certainly did not. "I want to change it," I said. Robert looked at me steadily. "In what direction?" I told him. He wrote it down. He asked clarifying questions, specific ones, the kind that showed he was following the reasoning precisely. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This is your right, obviously," he said. "Can I ask what's driving it?" I told him, briefly, without drama, what had been happening, the phone call, the years before it. He nodded slowly. "You understand this may create conflict if it becomes known." "I understand," I said. "I'm not trying to create conflict. I'm trying to make sure that what I've worked for my entire life goes where it will actually do some good." "That's a reasonable goal," said Robert. "The changes I made were not impulsive or vindictive. I want to be clear about that, because the story of what I did could easily be told as revenge, and it wasn't that. It was something more careful, more considered, more loving in its own way than revenge ever is. First, I established a trust for Lily, a direct trust in Lily's name, accessible to her at 25, and structured so that the management of it could never be placed in the hands of her parents during her childhood. Not because I doubted Marcus's love for her, but because I had watched Diane manage every other financial and structural element of their life together, and I was not willing to trust that money I worked for 31 years for would reach my granddaughter, rather than disappearing into Diane's organizational system. The trust was significant, a third of what I had. Second, I contacted the Children's Hospital where I'd volunteered for 5 years. I spoke with their development officer about a named endowment, a fund that would support nursing education scholarships in perpetuity, in my name and the name of my mother, whose chest is still in Marcus and Diane's garage as far as I know. This would be funded by another third of what I had. Third, Marcus. I kept Marcus in the will, but restructured what he would receive and when and how, with specific provisions that were designed not to punish him, but to protect what I was giving him from being absorbed into a shared estate where I had watched things that mattered disappear. I did all of this quietly, not secretly exactly. It was my will. I was the only one with the right to know its contents until I chose otherwise, but without announcement or drama. Robert drew up the documents, I signed them on a Tuesday in April, and I drove home and made tea and sat in my garden and felt the particular calm of someone who has done the thing they needed to do. Now, I want to tell you about the thing that happened in between, because the will was the end of a process, but it wasn't the process itself. The process was something internal, something that happened in the weeks between the phone call and the appointment with Robert, in the gray quiet of my days alone. I thought about Marcus. I thought about the 9-year-old and the man he'd become, and all the versions of him in between. I thought about what I had wanted for him, what I had worked for, what I had given up in those years of night shifts and tired mornings. It wasn't money, primarily. I had stopped thinking of the money as mine in any personal sense long before this. It was something harder to name. Transmission, maybe. The passing of something essential from one generation to the next. Not just money, but the meaning behind it. The idea that his mother had worked and built and been careful, and that this was a legacy, something that told the story of where he came from. What Diane had been doing, I came to understand, was something very specific. She wasn't just managing her home or guarding her space, she was controlling the narrative of Marcus's life, who he came from, what his past was, and who had a claim on him. She had moved my mother's chest to the garage. She had redirected conversations about his childhood. She had thinned the visits and reduced my presence until I was not a fact of his life, but a scheduled event. And then, not even that. She was rewriting Marcus, slowly and methodically, into someone whose story began with her. Understanding this helped me, not because it made me angry, but because it made me sad in a clear way, rather than a confused way. And clear sadness is easier to work with than confusion. I also thought about Marcus's choices. This was the harder thinking, the thinking I kept returning to at night. Marcus was 51 years old. He was not a child being managed without his knowledge. He had participated in what happened to me, whether he meant to or not, whether he was conscious of it or not. The pauses, the deflections, the Christmas table, the phone call. He had let it happen, each step of it, and accumulated letting it happen has its own kind of authorship.
I loved him and I forgave him. Both of those things were and are true. But love and forgiveness don't require pretending that something didn't happen. They don't require performing as though the shape of things hasn't changed. He called every Sunday, as promised. I answered every Sunday, and we talked. I didn't mention the ban. I didn't mention Diane. I asked about Lily and listened to the answers with my whole heart, because Lily was never the problem and never would be. I talked about my garden and my volunteer work and a book I was reading. I was warm because I am warm, because warmth is not something I withhold from people I love, even when they've hurt me. But I also listened differently than I had before. I listened for what he didn't say, the spaces in the conversation where a different kind of son might have said, "This is wrong, Mom, let me fix it." He didn't say that. He came close sometimes. I could hear him approaching it in the way he'd approach a hard thing, circling and circling. But he didn't get there. Not yet. In June, about 3 months after the phone call, Marcus asked if he could bring Lily to visit me at my house. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He came on a Saturday, just the two of them, and Lily ran through my door and announced herself as though she hadn't seen me in years, which felt that way even if the calendar said otherwise. She spent 40 minutes in my garden, very seriously investigating everything, and I followed her and answered her questions, all of them, every single one, because a 3.5-year-old's questions are among the most important questions in the world. Marcus and I had coffee while she played in the late afternoon sun, and he watched her with such transparent love that I felt the grief of the whole situation more sharply than I had in weeks. Because the grief isn't for what Diane has done, but for what Marcus might lose, the connective tissue between himself and his own past, his own people, his own child's understanding of where she comes from. "He talks about you," he said, "all the time. Nana L says this, Nana L says that." "Good," I said. A pause. "Mom," he said, and then nothing else for a moment. "It's okay," I said. "It's not," he said, quietly. I looked at him. He was looking at Lily. "I know it's not," I said, "but you don't need to solve it right now." He looked at me then, and I saw in his face what I can only describe as the specific pain of someone waking up to something they wish they'd seen sooner. Not fully awake, the process takes longer than a moment for people who don't want to see something, but moving in that direction. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine. I'm always fine." He knew what that meant. He'd been hearing me say it since he was 9 years old, and he knew that it was both true and insufficient, that I was fine in the way that people who have held things alone for a long time are fine. We didn't talk about anything specific that day, but something had moved, and I felt it, and I think he felt it too. In August, Marcus's aunt, my sister Patricia, came to visit me for a week. Patricia is 2 years younger than I am and has been my closest person for 70 years, and she has the particular quality of certain older women that makes them able to say things that other people can't say, not because they're rude, but because they've simply stopped caring about the social cost of honesty. She knew the situation. I'd told her on the phone months before. She stayed for the week, and we had the long, meandering conversations that you can only have with someone who has known you across your entire life. Conversations that aren't really about any one subject, but about everything at once. On the last day of her visit, she said, "Have you told Marcus about the will?" "No," I said. "You should," she said. "Why?" She thought about this for a moment. Not to threaten him, not to leverage him, just because he deserves to know the truth of things, about the money, about what you've built, about what your choices are. You've been protecting him from the real picture for a long time. Maybe that's part of the problem. I sat with that for the rest of the day after she left. It was the kind of observation that feels irritating when you first hear it because it lands somewhere true. Patricia was right. I had been protecting Marcus from the real picture. I'd protected him from the full knowledge of what the night shifts cost, protected him from knowing exactly how careful I'd been with money while raising him, protected him from the specific details of what I'd sacrificed and built, because I hadn't wanted him to carry that weight. I wanted him to simply receive it, cleanly, without obligation. But in doing so, I'd also let him not know who I was, not fully, not the part of me that was capable and careful and made something out of what I'd been given. Diane had moved into that gap. She'd filled it with her own narrative of who I was, the pleasant, financially unremarkable mother who kept things nice. I called Marcus on a Sunday in September, not one of our usual calls, a different call. Deliberately different, my voice carrying something he noticed immediately. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," I said, "but I want to talk to you about something real, and I want you to just listen first." "Okay," he said. I told him, all of it, not the will first, the life first, the night shifts, the numbers, the years of careful building, the specific amount in savings, the house, the inheritance from his grandmother, the total. I told him in the plain way of someone who is done protecting someone from real information. I watched in the silence on his end the recalibration happening. "Mom," he said, when I finished the financial part, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't. I didn't tell you. That was my choice. I'm telling you now." Then I told him about the will changes. Not to threaten, I was very careful about my tone, very careful that it didn't sound like a weapon, but clearly, specifically, so that he knew what his choices had affected. The trust for Lily, the endowment, the restructured inheritance. A long silence. "You changed it after she banned me from your house," I said. "Not out of anger, out of clarity. I wanted to make sure that what I've spent my life building goes where it will actually matter." "Mom," his voice had changed. "I know it was a significant decision," I said. "I didn't make it quickly." Another silence. Then, "I'm going to talk to Diane." "You don't have to, Mom," he said, and there was something different in the word now, something that had found its spine. "I need to, not because of the will, because I let something happen that I shouldn't have let happen, and I need to fix it." I didn't push. I didn't tell him what to say or how to say it. I just said, "Okay." He called me back in 4 days. I noted the 4 days. They told me that whatever conversation he'd had with Diane had been neither easy nor quick. "I told her everything," he said, "about the money, about what you built. She didn't know." "How did she respond?" A pause. "She was surprised." Another pause. "And I think she understood something differently." He was choosing his words carefully. "She's not easy to read, but she asked about you. She asked if you'd come to dinner." I sat with that for a moment. An invitation from Diane, filtered through Marcus, arrived at the end of a financial revelation. I was not naive about what had moved the needle, and I want to be honest about that, because I think the honesty matters. Money changes things. The knowledge of money changes things.
I did not love that this was true, but I had known it was true before I made the appointment with Robert, and I had factored it into my understanding of what I was doing. But I also believe, and I've thought about this carefully, that the money wasn't the whole of it. I believe that what I told Marcus about my life, the real story of it, the night shifts and the numbers and the building and the care, had done something independent of the will. I believe it had given him a version of me that was more complete than the one he'd been operating with, and that this completeness had given him something to stand on when he had the conversation with Diane. I said yes to the dinner. Of course, I said yes. I drove to their house on a Saturday evening in October, and Marcus opened the door before I reached it, and Lily flew past him to get to me first, as she always did, announcing herself, and I caught her, she's still just small enough to catch, and pressed my face against her hair. Diane was in the kitchen. She came out when I came in, and she looked at me in a way she hadn't looked at me before. Not warm, Diane is not built for warm exactly, but direct, honest in a way that our previous interactions had never been. "Eleanor," she said, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," I said. We stood there for a moment, the two of us, the shape of everything that had happened between us sitting in the air. And then she said, quietly, so Marcus couldn't quite hear, "I think I've been unfair." It was not a long sentence. It was not an apology exactly, not the full kind, not with all the details named and accounted for, but it was honest, and it was offered, and I have learned to recognize the difference between people who can't see their own behavior and people who can see it but have to be brought to the seeing by something significant. "I appreciate that," I said. I won't tell you that dinner changed everything, that the barrier dissolved, that Diane and I became friends in the warm, easy way of women who simply needed to understand each other. That would be a cleaner story than the true one. What actually happened was more gradual, more textured, a series of small repairs that will take time to complete, a careful rebuilding of something that was damaged and will bear the marks of the damage even when it's repaired. But my mother's chest came back into the house. I noticed it, in the living room, repositioned. I didn't comment on it, but I saw it, and the seeing felt like something significant. Lily started coming to visit me on her own, dropped off by Marcus on Saturday mornings, staying through lunch and sometimes into the afternoon, an arrangement that Diane had agreed to and that I suspected had cost her something, that agreement, and that I was therefore grateful for in a specific way. These Saturdays are the best hours of my week. We plant things in the garden, and she asks questions, and I answer every one. And she calls me Nana L in her serious narrator's voice. And I think about transmission, about what passes from one generation to the next, about the things that can survive even the years when the channel between people has been narrowed almost to nothing. I have not changed the will back. I want to be clear about that. The trust for Lily remains, structured as I structured it, because my granddaughter's financial future is too important to be contingent on the health of adult relationships that can always change again. The endowment remains, because my mother's name deserves to be in the world, and because those nursing scholarships will matter to young people who are where I was 50 years ago. What I gave to Marcus, I have restructured, yes, but I have not taken it away, and I never intended to take it away, only to shape it, to make sure it reaches him in a way that preserves what I put into it. What I've learned in all of this is something about the difference between being present and being known. For most of my son's adult life, I was present. I showed up, I called, I visited, I was careful and available and consistent, but I had not made sure I was known. I'd kept the full picture of myself, the capable, building, working, careful self, hidden, partly out of privacy, partly out of the deeply rooted belief that good things done in love shouldn't require acknowledgement. I had been working from behind the scenes, as I always had, and the result was that the people around me had been allowed to fill the gap of who I was with something smaller than the truth. I don't regret the years of doing things quietly. That's how I'm built, and it served a purpose, and I don't think it was wrong. But I think there's a version of selfless that becomes self-erasure, and I had crossed into that version without noticing, and the crossing had costs I'm still reckoning with. I am 73 years old, and I live alone in my house with my garden and my books, and my Thursday lunches with Carol, and my volunteer mornings at the hospital, and my Sunday calls with Marcus that are warmer now than they have been in years, and my Saturday mornings with Lily that are the still center of everything. I have made my will, and I know what it contains, and I have made peace with my choices. I did not fight to be readmitted to my son's life. I did not demand or threaten or perform my hurt for an audience. I sat in the quiet, and I thought clearly, and I made decisions that reflected the full truth of who I am, what I built, what I chose to do with it, and what I believe matters. And the door opened. Not all the way, not overnight, not with the weight of everything that came before, but it opened. The morning I drove back to Marcus and Diane's house for the first time after the ban, I sat in my car for a moment before going in. Not because I was afraid, I was past afraid, just pausing, the way you pause when you recognize that something significant is happening, and you want to be present for it. Lily saw me from the window. She pressed her face against the glass and waved with her whole arm. I waved back. Then I got out of the car and walked to the door. Some people spend their whole lives being mistaken for less than they are, and they go to their graves without ever being seen clearly, not by the people who were supposed to see them, not by the children they built everything for. I almost became that story. I was close enough to it to feel the shape of it. What saved me wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was the simple decision made on a quiet afternoon in a lawyer's office to let the true record speak. To stop protecting everyone from the real picture of who I was and what I had done, to trust that the truth, when finally told, would be enough. It was enough. If someone in your life has ever looked past you without seeing the whole of who you are, tell me in the comments. You might be further from invisible than you think.